Chapter 1. A Child Cries. Somewhere in the desert a child cries. He can see the open back of his family station wagon fading in the distance, his brother's hands waving a final farewell. Their smiles shrink to pinpoints, and the heat from the pavement turns the car into shimmering waves until nothing but the long black highway remains. Too young to be scared, he stands there just staring into the distance, wondering what he'd done to drive them away. He finds no answer in the silence. Not knowing what to do, he sits down on the shoulder of the two-lane road to wait for their return. Mommy had always said that if they were ever separated, he should just sit down and wait. He had to do this before many times, and sooner or later they always came back. The highway was all but deserted in the summer heat. A long time passes between cars, each one blowing up the dust in the windless heat to sting his eyes and burn his throat. When he had first sat down, the sun was high in the sky. Its light, unfiltered, burns everything it touches. As it crawls across the barren land, it pulls the life from everything beneath its gaze. Now it was almost touching the horizon where his family had disappeared. Still he looks and waits. Hungry and alone, he begins to cry. The crunching of gravel disturbs his broken sobs, and he hears the voice of a stranger. A kind voice. A woman's voice asking him his name. He tries to answer, but the only sound that comes out is a sandy crackle. "Honey," she calls, and soon water is given to the sunburned child. Spilling the contents of the jug onto his face, his body soaks up the water more quickly than the ground beneath him. "Better now?" He responds with a shaky nod. "Now then, what's your name, honey?" "Ronnie." And the tears begin to fall again. He feels a hand stroke his head, and strong arms reach around him as she lifts him from the gravel and into her arms. He nestles against the stranger's bosom as the tears fade into silence, the silence into dreams. Hours and hours in the desert heat this child sat by the highway awaiting the return of his family. He had been left before and would be again by those entrusted with his care. In the fading daylight, his body drained, his heart broken, an angel appears. Strangers on their way to somewhere stop on the side of the road. Setting aside their plans for a moment, they reach out with a simple gift. A gift of love. Of course, I was that child. The strangers on the highway, just strangers. But what they gave to me, I share with you now. You see, there's one thing I've learned for sure and for certain. The effects of love and the effects of hate are cumulative. One event adds to others of its kind and builds the life of the individual so affected. I lived a life of misery and pain because that is what my family fed me. In between times, nurses and doctors and fellow patients and sometimes just plain folks would reach into their hearts and share with me a gift of love. This love continued to build one dose on top of another until the balance of my heart shifted. A process as certain as the tide. When it was time, when I had found enough love, my life changed. While most of the love I received were simple gifts, I began to search for it. As I traveled, I looked for hope. I found it in the eyes of strangers. When I saw it, I went to them following the light of love, and love is what they shared. Sometimes it was laughter, sometimes a willing ear. Sometimes it was simply one passer-by smiling at another, but it was all love, and I soaked it up like the flowers soak up the sunshine. Certainly we all know well the product of pain and hardship. But is that what really matters? For me, as I passed through this life, I was challenged at every turn. Usually I just let myself be pushed, going whichever way the world would shove me. Every time I attempted to gain release, the world would shove harder and harder until I would break, thereby maintaining the status quo. Slave maintained as slave. All the wounds of my past, they're still there. As I reread the pages I prepared for you, many tears return. The pain is never really gone, though it can be overcome. What matters now is what has always mattered. Love heals all wounds. It builds character and trust, joy and peace. It builds understanding beyond comprehension. Compassion takes the place of apathy, and we are lifted from the ashes of our pain, no matter how badly we are scarred. I remember a time when I was in the hospital, a burn ward in Portsmouth Naval Hospital filled with soldiers from a war in a faraway land. Many of these never lived to leave the hospital. Many did. All had been transformed by fire and napalm and other weapons too terrible to mention into disfigured souls. Few would ever recognize their own faces again. I was a bit more fortunate. My burn was chest and neck and right arm. Some were burned completely head to toe. They say the worst injury of all is the burning of your flesh. I believe that the greatest pain was the surgeries and the wounds the doctors inflicted upon me. As I lay there in the hospital bed, my legs covered by a tent, the soldier next to me told me a story. He told me about some men he'd found in the jungle. GIs, having been captured, had been tortured to death by their captors. All the skin had been peeled from their bodies 1 square inch at a time. After exposing the tender nerves, they would blow on the wound, sending the soldiers into agony that extracted from them their dignity and the information they sought. I can vouch for the efficacy of the treatment, too. You see, the tent was there to keep the air from my legs. The doctors, attempting a new technique, had peeled the skin off both my thighs. 4 patches, each 6 inches by 10, and stitched it to my chest. Then they put me in an upper body cast to prevent movement which might dislodge the freshly grafted tissue. Any movement, no matter how slight, was like a blowtorch on my skin. I was 8 years old. Still, in that hospital bed, the same soldier who didn't make it spent some time sharing with me. He talked of home, of the places he had been, the people he had seen, and shared with me a gift of life which I could never hope to pay. You see, I knew he couldn't move. He had no legs. His arms were mostly gone, too. His face was melted on the side farthest from me, but he could still smile. I know it sounds strange, this bitterness being shared, helping me to grow, but it did. In this ward where few people could walk for amputations, I found an inner strength. One day after the surgery, I was laying there when I smelled the food cart coming into the ward. It always lifted the spirits of the patients, myself included. So many joys of this life had been lost, but we could still enjoy the taste of mashed potatoes and gravy and whatever passed for meat. I decided I was going to get my own tray. On strict bed rest, I ignored the nurses telling me to stay. I got up from my bed announcing that I would serve myself this time. The soldiers who had taken me under their collective wings urged me on. Calls of, "You can do it!" and "Go on, dude!" echoed in the concrete chamber like a war cry. Don't let 'em keep you down. It seemed that the whole room, filled with the maimed and dying, came alive at my determination, and a new level of excitement came. We were family. I stumbled down the open hall, leaning on the beds I passed, the look in the eyes of all the patients telling a story of their own. The sounds of encouragement grew louder and louder the closer I got to the cart until I was there. I had to rest for a moment before attempting the return with the tray, so I leaned on a bed. This man was silent, but there were tears in my eyes as he looked at me with longing. "It's going to be okay," I told him. I reached for the cart, and the nurse tried to stop me. "Here, let me get that for you." "No," was my reply, and I pulled the tray out of the shiny wagon. It was a lot heavier than I remembered. Still, I had to go on. I turned from the dolly and started back toward my bed. Thinking I would use the beds for support on the way back, I stayed close. Too close, it seems. As I was walking past one of the beds, amid the raucous cries and the cheering soldiers, I brushed against the corner of a soldier's bed and I went down. As I fell, I began to cry. Save for the sounds of the rolling plates and silverware, silence fell on the room like a blanket. All eyes turned toward me, and the man on the bed next to where I had fallen told me, "It's okay, son. You remind me of my brother. Nothing could stop him either." I dried my tears and swallowed the pain and got up from the floor. One by one, the soldiers started clapping, slowly at first, then in a rising crescendo that lifted that room far from the level of the dead and dying. For in that moment, we all rose together. We fell together, and we rose again. Together, we became something more than we were before. Listen to the cries. You can hear them, can't you? Their cries, as they fed me strength, now feed you. I hope they're aware of the power of the gift they gave. If not, that's okay, because you do, you know, in a way that only you can. Remember, it's going to be okay. Thanksgiving. Today is the day of Thanksgiving. For the country is one to be grateful for all of our land's special gifts, for the fruit of the earth and the trees. Today, loving families are joining and toiling together to make all of the age-old favorites that will fill with wonders their plates. Before the first bite is taken, the heads of most families shall lead all generations present in a prayer that acknowledges need that exists in many houses all across the land, and asks the Almighty Spirit to take into His hand those children of His that are hungry, and to feed them through His might. Then they'll all begin eating turkeys and dressings and pies. But when all the feasting is over and each has made his way home, how many remember the call they have rendered to take care of the needy ones? Their prayers may all have been honest, intended to speak their concerns. But did it come from their hearts as believers? Have these revelers yet truly learned that we are to be God's instruments? In order for us to relieve the pain that lives all around us, we must truly believe and trust in His voice when it's spoken. To fulfill every one of our needs, His voice will deliver through every believer to the suffering you're prayed for relief. So in the hours that pass while you're driving or walking along on your way the rest of the year, remember so clear your prayer this Thanksgiving Day. Hi everybody, my name is Ron Hatton and I am the author of A Book of Life. Now, since day one when I finished making the book, I studied about bookbinding techniques. It was always too expensive for me to have a publisher do it for me. So what I did was decided to make my own, and the result is this. Now, this is a hand-bound copy, ribbon, paper, all of that folded by hand. And if you should like to have a copy of this for yourself or for someone you love, then all you have to do is email me at gadgetman@gadgetmangroove.com. Just watch the slide. The email address is coming. God bless y'all richly and warmly, and as always, remember to smile for a stranger today. You will both be glad you did. Bye-bye.